از صدای سخن عشق ندیدم خوشتر، یادگاری که در این گنبد دوار بماند.
Calligrapher Mir Ali Halavi allegedly composed a verse in which he says, "O calligrapher, as long as thy pen continues to work miracles, it is fitting if form proclaims superiority over meaning." And we are here around 1540 in Bukhara, in a different part of the world when Europe is experiencing Renaissance. And here you have a calligrapher who is telling you about the calligraphy he's practicing. You get somewhere through contemplation. And it's very interesting to take that specimen of calligraphy by another calligrapher whose name is Mirimad Hassani. Mirimad Hassani, who was active in Isfahan in the early 17th century, he produced at different times the same calligraphy of the same verse, which is about what you can achieve with your hands. And those two calligraphies look exactly identical. But once you start looking at them and looking at them closely, you gaze at them and you notice that there is one difference. In the word hitch, that means nothing. In one calligraphy, it is written like contracted, short. On the other page, it is written long. And that's the only difference between the two calligraphies. You can point to that difference. It changing the overall idea of that page completely. And you can get it only if you take the time, if you pace yourself and look at the calligraphy, at the style, at the form, and that you forget about the meaning. This is art for art. The form is more important than the content.
مرا به کار جهان هرگز التفات نبود، رخ تو در نظر من چنین خوشش آراست.
که شعر حافظ که دیگه اوج سخن فارسیه نیاز داشته که به ذائقه ایرانی نوشته بشه و به همین خاطر نستعلیق به وجود اومده، برای نوشتن غزل فارسی، برای نوشتن زبان فارسی. زبان فارسی نرم و روانه و خط نستعلیق هم نرم و روانه.
Moi, quand je vois le Nesta'liq, je pense à la difficulté du kalam. C'est la première chose qui vient à mon esprit. Je pense parce que quand j'ai essayé un petit peu, la première chose que j'avais remarqué, c'est ce que tu m'as appris, les dents du kalam, la manière que vraiment le kalam il est en train de danser sur la page et qu'on est en train, et que aussi en même temps, il faut qu'on utilise les deux mains en coordination pour écrire. C'est ce qui n'est pas du tout le cas dans Thulu, surtout sur Muhakkak, que le kalam est très rigide, on a très peu de nuances et c'est beaucoup plus statique. Et je dirais que le Nesta'liq c'est dynamique et vraiment il y a cette danse du kalam sur la feuille qui est très très difficile à maîtriser justement.
در خوشنویسی و موسیقی به نظر من انتخاب شعر یا انتخاب متن پایه اساسیه، چه به لحاظ فرمی، استتیک و هنری و چه از لحاظ معنایی. و این خیلی مهمه از نظر معنایی، به این دلیل که تا اون رابطه حسی بین هنرمند و اون متنی که میخواد چه به صورت موسیقی در بیاره و چه به صورت اثر خوشنویسی، حالا چه در بعد سنتیش و چه در بعد مدرن و معاصرش، باید اون ارتباط اول حس ایجاد بشه.
Persian poetry carries within it history, myth, legend, religion, lyric, love, different dramatic situations. It is the central art, I think, of Persian culture. It seems to me that the interaction between the Nesta'liq script and the lines of Persian poetry itself are almost like mirrors or elaborations of each other. The calligraphic Nesta'liq script is so fluid and so gracious as it moves down the page or it curls around a text with the dots floating around.
اولین قدم انتخاب حتی یک کلمه است که من شخصا خیلی رو این قضیه کار کردم و دوست می‌دارم. گاهی وقتا تو یک غزل یک کلمه است که به نظر من اساره تمام اون غزله و اون میتونه برای من کافی باشه. یعنی من لزوما به دنبال متن طولانی نیستم تو کارم و فکر کنم که در دوران معاصر اصولا ما باید مقداری به ایجاز و گزیدگویی رو بیاریم. پدیده ما تو موسیقی هم می‌بینیم، توی خوشنویسی معاصر هم می‌بینیم. بنابراین ترکیبات خوشنویسی معاصر الان بیشتر حتی در قالب سنتیش مختصرتر شده.
مکارم تو به آفاق میبرد شاعر، از او وظیفه و زاد سفر دریغ مدار.
In the Islamic world, particularly during the early centuries, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, but even beyond, calligraphy was always understood to be one of the highest forms of human expression, one of the greatest artistic modalities of this new faith. Why? Because when the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, it had to be transcribed. So those early transcriptions are in effect the Word of God. And the purity of the scribe becomes important. The hand of God, the word of God, become a dimension of one's personality as one transcribes these incredibly important words. So calligraphy was elevated by its association, first with the Quran and then beyond, to one of the highest forms of artistic expression imaginable.
بعد از خط کوفی جریانی هست که 6 خط با عنوان خطوط ششگانه یا خطوط سته ابداع شدند که وضع و اختراع این خطوط رو به ابن مغله فارسی که خوشنویسیه که اصالتاً منسوب به استان فارس هست، روستای بیضا، که در بغداد ایشون وزیر خلیفه عباسی بوده که اینها در کاربرد با هم متفاوتند. خط نسخ برای کتابت و استنساخ استفاده می شده، سلس و محقق برای جلی نویسی و کتیبه نگاری استفاده می شده و خط رقاع و توقی برای مراسلات و احکام و اسناد و فرامین بیشتر استفاده می شدند. اما بعد از این جریان ایرانیان تصمیم گرفتند که خطی برای مکاتبات و مراسلات ابداع بکنند که صرفاً متون فارسی به اون نوشته بشه در نتیجه دست به ابداع خطی زدند که کاملا در جغرافیای ایران وضع شده و اون خط تعلیق هست. خط تعلیق ابتدا برای نگارش اسناد و مکاتبات و در دیوان مراسلات صورت گرفته، برای نگارش زبان فارسی و اسناد فارسی و بعدها تقریباً وارد شده در حوزه استنساخ، قطعه نویسی، مرقعات و زمینه پیدایش نستعلیق رو خط تعلیق ایجاد میکنه.
خوشنویسی اسلامی در ایران توسط منشیان دربار ساسانی یا دیوان ساسانی شروع شد و به تدریج خوشنویسان هویت مستقل پیدا کردند و نقش ایرانیان در به وجود آمدن خطوط ششگانه که عبارتند از نسخ، ثلث، محقق، ریحان، توقیع، رقا که بین همه مسلمان ها از حدود 1100 سال پیش تا کنون رواج داره و هنوز هم رواج داره. نقش ایرانیان خیلی مهم بود در به وجود آمدن این 6 خط. کمی از این جریان نگذشته که حافظ به عرصه میاد در نیمه دوم قرن 8، یعنی حدود 750 دیگه اوج حافظ هستش و در همین زمان هم از تلفیق خط تعلیق و نسخ که تلفیق یک کمی پیچیده است و نسخ خط ساده ای هستش، یه خطی به وجود میاد بینابین که هم ظریفه هم خوانا و نه اینه نه اون، از هر کدوم چیزایی رو گرفته و به همین خاطر نسخ تعلیق نام میگیره که بعدها تبدیل میشه به نستعلیق. و در پایان عمر حافظ این خط رسمی میشه به طوری که در اون موقع کتاب‌ها به خط نستعلیق نوشته میشه، یعنی درست در پایان کار حافظ.
The Nasta'liq calligraphy or the Nasta'liq style developed in the course of the 14th century in Iran. Allegedly, it was invented by a calligrapher named Mir Ali Tabrizi, but we know through recent research that it took decades for the style to come into fruition, into existence. It's like he probably did not invent Nasta'liq from one day to another. He probably synthesized all the experiments that were conducted by scribes and copyists all over Iran. He fixed the script, he codified the script. That's why his name remained famous. The treatises will tell you that Mir Ali Tabrizi, so the inventor of the script, had a dream. And in this dream, Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, who is also the first Shia Imam, appeared in a dream to Mir Ali. And he told Mir Ali to start writing like if he was looking at a goose. And so the shape of the body of a goose should conduct him to draw the lines. That's sort of like sinuous lines, like the wings of a flying goose. And allegedly, that's how Nasta'liq came into existence. It's probably a fable. But what it tells you, and it's very important, it links calligraphic practice to basically religion. If Nasta'liq was developed basically between Shiraz, Tabriz, and Iraq with Baghdad, rapidly it spread all over Iran. It's the time in the 15th century with the Timurids. It was adopted almost instantaneously by scribes and calligraphers to copy works in Persian mainly. Poetry, historical treatises, and so it becomes the script par excellence to pen Persian, and continuously it was used everywhere in the main centers of Iran under the Safavids in Shiraz, Yazd, Tabriz, Qazvin, and Isfahan eventually. What testifies to the success of Nasta'liq as a script that it wasn't used only in Iran. It spread out of the border of Iran and quite rapidly. So we have examples of Nasta'liq used in Turkey, in the nascent Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, but also eastward, like in India, the South Asian continent during the Sultanate period, and then in the Mughal Empire. It is mainly because like Persian was the language of culture at the time. Persian was spoken in all those courts, and of course also you have the journey of the calligraphers and the artists in general. There was a lot of wars, and a lot of Persian artists basically become émigrés. Those calligraphers migrate, and with them the Nasta'liq style move as well. And then with the silsile system of apprenticeship, basically new schools of calligraphy developed. And eventually, from the 16th, 17th century onward, there will be an Ottoman school of Nasta'liq calligraphy. There will be a Mughal school of calligraphy. To the point that Nasta'liq calligraphy, its identity is going to shift. And the Ottomans are going to make Nasta'liq their own style that they will call eventually Talik. The Mughals will do the same.
بعد از فترت دوره صفوی تا دوره قاجار که دوباره احیا شد، زیبایی شناسی خط اشباع شد. یعنی دوره قاجار یک روحی توی خطش هست که هر کسی بخواد تقلید کنه از خوشنویسان دوره قاجار، دوره متقدمان رو، هر چه کوشش کنه باز روح دوره قاجار رو یه آدم متخصص و یه کارشناس کارکشته میتونه ببینه.
Mir Ahmad was a late 16th century, early 17th century master of Nesta'لیق. He became the model for many calligraphers who followed him during his lifetime and for centuries later. He was the chief calligrapher at the court of Shah Abbas I in Isfahan. He later clashed with his rival Ali Reza Abbasi. He was assassinated in 1615, possibly at the command of the Shah. He's probably one of the revered figures in the history of Nesta'liq. He had a huge following in his lifetime, but all the way into the 19th century. And we know, for example, this calligrapher by the name of Mirza Ghulam Reza Isfahani. He followed his model and perfected Mir Ahmad's style, but added some innovations to Mir Ahmad's script. That was usually how it worked. A calligrapher was supposed to faithfully copy his master's model, but sometimes the calligrapher would introduce new flourishes and make little changes that became his contribution to the tradition of the script. And Mir Ahmad was popular not only in the Persianate world, but in Mughal India, as well as in Ottoman Turkey. In fact, there are many Mughal albums that contain the work of Mir Ahmad. Mughal royalty and Mughal rulers and princes knew his work and found it very desirable. So when albums were compiled, often you also have Mir Emad's work included in these albums. Mir Emad is credited the innovator who introduced the artistic mashq. There's something called the artistic mashq, because mashq is the practice of any calligrapher. It's not necessarily always meant to be artistic, but Mir Emad introduced the artistic mashq. It became very desirable for people to have a work of artistic mashq, whether it's an individual page or an album. It became a desirable, let's say, commodity or a desirable collectible. People wanted to collect, people wanted to own these, people wanted to give them as gifts to other people because they were sort of equivalent to an imprint of the calligrapher's hand. It's like the most genuine mark of a calligrapher's hand. So it was very nice for people to have that pure sign of a calligrapher or pure mark of a calligrapher's hand, so that if you gave it as a gift, it had a lot of meaning to it, even more than something that's finished, a calligraphy that was finished and illuminated, although those were also very highly prized. This idea of the mashq as a collectible is something that Mir Emad had a big role in popularizing. These mashq by Mir Emad were so prized, like in the Qajar period in the 19th century, the king had his Mir Emad's mashq photographed, and then albums were made of the photographs of Mir Emad's mashq. And this idea also of the imprint of a calligrapher's hand somehow gets transferred to the rulers. A lot of rulers like Fath Ali Shah during the Qajar period, or Nasiruddin Shah, and rulers before them, they were trained calligraphers too, and they. So there was this concept of giving an imprint of their hand to their subordinates, where it was what they called Dastkhat Humayuni. It was like the handwriting of the ruler or the king. So this was like the king giving a piece of himself to his subordinates, to his court, to his officials in his court, etc.
خوشنویسی سنتی ما که از دوره تیموری و دوره صفوی به تدریج پخش شد در دنیا. استقبال خارجی ها به عنوان یک هنر ملی جمع‌آوری کردن. در بخش اسلامی حتما شما قطعاتی از خوشنویسان سلف، از خوشنویسان متقدم و متأخر که دوره قاجار باشه، شما آثاری رو پیدا میکنید.
سعی نابرده در این راه به جایی نرسی. مزد اگر می طلبی طاعت استاد ببر.
This idea of practicing and how important it is, this calligrapher by the name of Sultan Ali Mashhadi, who was a master of Nesta'liq, he once said that you will abandon peace and sleep even from your tender years. And he went on to say that Collect the writings of the masters, throw a glance at this and that. For whomever you feel a natural attraction besides his writing, you must not look at others, so that your eye should become saturated with his writing. And because of his writing, each of your letters should become like a pearl.
از نظر سنت همیشه با یه استاد کار شده. یعنی استاد خوشنویس شاگرد رو میپذیره، مینویسه براش و رموز این نوشته رو بهش یاد میده، راجع به شناخت وسایل صحبت میکنه، راجع به فرهنگ خوشنویسی صحبت میکنه، راجع به این موضوع خوشنویسی صحبت میکنه. در نتیجه یک سری عوامل رو برای هنرجو میگه و او کلمه و نوشته رو تمرین میکنه تا استاد بپسنده. در واقع میشه یک مقلد کامل و یک مقلد سرسپرده به کسی که مهارت این کار داره.
La partie préférée du processus, c'est quand on est en cours et qu'on assiste à nos propres corrections et aux corrections avec le maître.
La calligraphie, encore une fois, persane, c'est classique, c'est très réglé, c'est très normé. Et il y a des étapes pour le travail d'apprentissage comme pour le travail de création. Et en fait, toutes les étapes, elles sont importantes.
In order to become a master calligrapher, you had to earn a formal license, which is referred to as a ijaza or ijazeh. So this involved to practice for years with your master, copying his example, which is referred to as naql kardan, naql. So the master's calligraphy becomes the model for the student to follow. And the student has to perfect the script, perfect his letters, perfect the proportions in order to obtain this ijaza, which qualifies him to be a master in his own right.
در انجمن خوشنویسان ایران دوره‌های مقدماتی و متوسط و خوش و عالی و ممتاز هست، فوق ممتاز و البته استادی رو داریم که از قدیم بوده. اما در کشورهای همجوار یا در مناطق همجوار اونها یک نوشته‌ای به نام اجازه دارند که هنوز هم مرسومه.
J'ai démarré la calligraphie avec Maître Bahman depuis 1 an et demi, donc c'est relativement récent. Et la première chose que j'ai réellement sentie, c'est le fait de s'inscrire dans une silsila. C'est un mot arabe pour dire que c'est une série, donc une succession de chaînes qui ont un lien les uns avec les autres.
من معمولاً از هنرجوام میخوام که بعد از اینکه با یک مطلبی روبرو میشن که میخوان اونو با خوشنویسی بکنن، خیلی بهش فکر بکنن، مفهومش رو پیدا بکنن، برای اینکه یک خوشنویس باید بتونه که از ظاهر کلمات باطن مفهوم رو منتقل بکنه. خوشنویس از زیبایی کلمات، رقص کلمات، هندسه روحانی که کلمات دارن استفاده میکنه، اونها رو کنار همدیگه میچینه که بتونه اون مفهومی رو که در دل اون مطلب وجود داره بتونه منتقل بکنه.
ترسم که اشک در غم ما پرده در شود، این راز سر به مهر به عالم سمر شود. گویند سنگ لعل شود در مقام صبر، آری شود ولیک به خون جگر شود. خواهم شدن به میکده گریان و دادخواه، که از دست غم خلاص دل آنجا مگر شود. اینجا برای من فرصتی هستش توی همین فضا که من خیلی از در واقع جرقه‌های کارام اینجا زده میشه، هم برای خودم البته، هم برای روحم و برای جانم و برای ارتباطم با فرهنگ ایران، و دیگه اینکه برای من منبع الهام و کارهای هنریم هستش.
راهیست راه عشق که هیچش کناره نیست، آنجا جز آن که جان بسپارند چاره نیست.
In Shiraz, I decided I would visit the Hafez's tomb. The Masala Garden, there was his tomb, and everywhere were these gorgeous texts, which were clearly part of the poems. And I went to his tomb, and I looked at his tomb, this beautiful white marble alabaster, and across the tomb was this most beautiful poetry, just visually gorgeous. Of course, it was Nesta'liq script. When you're 20 years old, you make vows. I said, I'm going back to school, and I will learn to read this, and I will make the translations of this poetry that I wish I had.
یک اثر تمام عیار و فرم متفاوت میتونه هر بیننده علاقمندی رو هیجان زده بکنه. گاهی وقتا هستش که ما به یه اثر خوشنویسی نگاه میکنیم، اینقدر محو زیبایی او میشیم که اصلا نمیخونیم اون رو، فقط به زیبایی او توجه میکنیم. گاهی وقتا بارها اون اثر رو میبینیم ولی یادمون نمیاد که متنش چی بوده.
کلمه الله رو من ذکر کلمه الله رو یه سری کار دارم به اسم الله. این به خاطر عشق و علاقه با احساسات، با عواطف خیلی خوشایندی و اعتقاد خیلی خوشایند ارائه شده و اتفاقا این ارائه خوشایند منتقل میشه به بیننده، چون وقتی نگاه میکنه نقاشی یا هنر یا خطاطی نمیبینه، یه چیزی دانسیه، یه روحیه، یه چیزی که خودم هم حق بازی های نقاشی و اطلاعات کمپوزیشن و فلان اینا رو اصلا رعایت نمیکنم، این به وجود میاد.
The act of copying was intended to strengthen a calligrapher's hand and instill concentration and discipline. Some people equate it with like even meditation. It's like a meditative practice.
کلمات وقتی که خوب کنار هم میشینن حس غریبی برای من ایجاد میکنن. من معمولاً وقتی که در اجرای اول تمامی حسم رو میتونم توی اون کلمات منتقل بکنم، این بسیار منو هیجان زده میکنه، برای اینکه احساس میکنم من با کلمات مرتبط بودم، کلمات کاملاً با مفهوم مرتبط بودن و در یک لحظه اینها به یک مرکزیتی رسیدن. یعنی ما از یک کثرتی به یک نقطه مشترک رسیدیم و اینجاست که واقعا لحظه خیلی نابیه.
دل چو پرگار به هر سو دورانی می کرد و اندر آن دایره سرگشته پابرجا بود.
Throughout the Islamic world, calligraphy can take on a decorative dimension. Artists and calligraphers were very thoughtful about how they used the letters, how they formed them, how they shaped them. Sometimes they even embroider them, right? They twist them and bend them together in order to make a surface look more beautiful. And that's what I think is so extraordinary when you look at the breadth of calligraphy in the Islamic world, even to the present, is an endless variety and ability to adapt to specific conditions. Throughout the historic period, calligraphy always was specifically attached to a purpose, whether it was to convey poetry on an album page. But by the 20th century, calligraphers were beginning to think of calligraphy as a completely independent, abstracted mode of expression.
Nesta'liq, as we mentioned earlier, is known for its versatility, its elegance, its proportional shapes. It inspired many modern and contemporary artists to create compelling compositions.
So you have a Hossein Zenderudi and a Parviz Tanavoli who, in a way, make the actual letters the art itself. They disengage it from a specific couplet, phrase, or meaning. So abstracted it, twisted it, braided it, complicated it, that it is in fact the sheer beauty of these forms that you're meant to read. The same is true with a Muhammad Asai, for instance.
These artists would abstract the Nesta'liq letters, and they would create composition almost in the same idea of mash, where the verbal clarity is not so important. A master calligrapher who is a formally trained calligrapher like Muhammad Asai creates abstractions of calligraphy where he takes the letters and closely intertwines them like the warp and weft of a carpet.
در وهله اول بیننده وقتی مواجه میشه میگرده دنبال یه چیز آشنا، برای اینکه نوشته است دیگه. نوشته رو در وهله اول میخواد ببینه چیه. اولین سوالی که از من میکنن راجع به کمپوزیشن، راجع به اندازه، راجع به تکنیک سوال نمیکنن، میگن چی نوشتی؟ میگم نوشتم. چی نوشتی؟ نوشتم. این سوال هی مرتب تکرار میشه، برای اینکه خودم هم نمیدونم چی نوشتم. موضوع من بیان ادبی یا متن ماندگار یا انتقال مفهومی نیست.
Historically or Today, in the modern times we live, artists have always appreciated the versatility and malleability of the letters of the Nesta'لیق script. And whether they're trying to convey a verse of poetry or some combination of letters that has no verbal meaning to it, what they emphasize is the beauty of the script and the possibilities, the endless possibilities that it offers.
Shatter Poems was a challenge for me to create a painting using a verse from Rumi, 13th century Persian poet. More than just doing a traditional calligraphy, I wanted the art to have a contemporary approach. So what I decided to do is to take this verse and disconnect the specific words that I wanted to emphasize on. When I did that, I went further to isolate the letters and look at them and place them on my canvas in a more unexpected way. By doing so, I realized that each and every one of these letters were so distinguished, they were so unique, they were so interesting in their own form that I just wanted to take that and do something with that abstraction. So that's how it all began. So I moved completely away from creating something directly from a phrase from a poem to something that was just limited to the one source, one letter. If you think about it, we have these letters in the Nesta'لیق scripts that are so expressive. They all have personalities. We have this, for example, we have the te, which is T. You see this gorgeous elongated shape, and it's a bit heavy on one side, and then it just tapers into this elegant little tip at the end. Shattered Poems began as paintings. When I was creating the letters together to create my gesture or vocabulary, I felt like the letters were sculptural in feel. I kept moving them increments at a time, playing with them, but all of a sudden I felt like there was this heartbeat, as if they were real. They wanted to jump out, and I knew at that moment that I needed to create this as a three-dimensional piece. To do that, I was exploring many different materials. I decided to use steel because I think it has a nice way of juxtapositioning this elegant, beautiful Nesta'لیق script in this heavy, weighty medium. The script itself had such incredible forms and such beauty that I could actually use it to create my own language.
The way that Persian poetry is done in the old manuscripts is very orderly. There's a rectangle, and the lines are made, the good calligraphers made each half line exactly the same width. And so you had beautiful borders, and you had these orderly half lines running down the page in parallel. And within that order, you have this extraordinary movement of the text itself. And it's just visually beautiful. It draws you in. When you see lines of Hafez done as freestanding calligraphic images inside a frame, the calligraphy itself reflects what the line says. When you see Persian poetry in a typeface or a different script, it doesn't look the same.
One of the challenges that brings forth the technology is, how do I bring this beautiful Nesta'لیق form into the digital space so I can create? Because I'm not a calligrapher, I'm a graphic designer. In this case, it's a software that I call قلم برتر, which means a better pen. It will give me what are the considerations that I can have with a touch of somebody who's not necessarily trained in calligraphy, I can have beautiful forms that reflect what a calligrapher would do. In my opinion, this is craft. It's just the digital craft. Nestعلیق is still as beautiful as it was. It's still expressing it. If anything, in this case, I'm taking a beautiful heritage. I'm opening it up to others that may not have had a chance to study the script, to allow themselves to create with. And looking at Nestعلیق's presence in 21st century, one can't ignore the new paradigm of the digital space, because Nestعلیق, like many other calligraphy styles, is quite complex, but perhaps I would say it's probably one of the more complex scripts, and definitely, if not the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful scripts. What we do need is Nestعلیق to be alive, is to be used, is to be loved in the new spaces. And this is what is unique about Nestعلیق, that the young generation, partially because of access to these tools, partially because of their passion about the culture that some of them may think is kind of disappearing, they want to have a Nestعلیق tattoo, or they want to be able to put Nestعلیق and make a logo from it, or they want to use Nestعلیق as part of their artwork, perhaps like I am. So I can't think of too many other things that the new generation looks at from 700 years ago and says, yes, we love that, and we want to kind of keep doing that. So looking at history of Iran and seeing how Nestعلیق has been used as part of the culture. In this case, one of the first newspapers in Iran has Nestعلیق throughout, whether at the headline, body copy. In my explorations on different forms and aesthetics that allows me to express my identity as an Iranian who resides outside Iran, who loves the poetry, but perhaps can't even recite more than a dozen quotes. How do I express myself visually as an Iranian outside Iran in the diasporic frame? And Nestعلیق definitely has been a spiritual presence, perhaps one can say, by looking at the artistic practices that other amazing artists like perhaps Faramarz Pilaram comes to my mind, has implemented the textures, the beauty, the negative, the positive, the rhythm of Nestعلیق in his art. Those inspirations have become part of my psyche, part of my visual practice, without specifically knowing that I'm using the curves or I'm using elements that come directly from a specific character in Nestعلیق. When I look at it, and when others look at it, they kind of say, is that Puya's work? Is that a style that you're developing? And I can't really answer that question because it's not a specific act. It's a presence of the spirit of Nestعلیق, the essence of Nestعلیق that has trickled down in my work that definitely was not here maybe 15 years ago in my work. And the last step of that conversation is the digital space, because that has allowed me to bring it more, explore more. And sooner or later, looking at what I've done, stepping back, I can see the flows, I can see the rhythms, I can see the dimensions that point and echo Nestعلیق's spirit.
اینا سیامش‌های معاصر من هستن، با همون ذهنیت، با همون حس، منتها تو یک پرزنتاسیون جدید و امروزی شاید. تنها چیزی که آگاهی دارم نسبت به این قطعه این است که باید صبور بود و باید یه راه طولانی و با همین اجزای کوچیک تصویری و برای من کاملا ملودیک، یعنی من تک تک اینا رو به صورت اصوات و نوت‌های موسیقی میشناسم که داره کنار هم چیده میشه تا یک قطعه، یک سمفونی، یک اثر موسیقایی در واقع تولید بشه. و من در ذهنم و در حتی در زمزمه های داخلی خودم دارم این نوت های موسیقی رو زمزمه میکنم.
در ازل پرتو حسنت ز تجلی دم زد، عشق پیدا شد و آتش به همه عالم زد.
In 1573, the Safavid ruler Shah Tahmasp is sending to Murad III, the Ottoman Sultan, for his accession to the throne, a copy of the Shahnameh and also a copy of the Quran, which are usually the two works that you would send to your counterpart. Now, the particularity of the copy of the Quran that Tahmasp sent to Murad III is that it was copied in Nasta'liq. Nasta'liq was not especially the holy text of Islam. So there is a message here that the calligrapher wanted to pass, but then the Shah also wanted to make to his Ottoman counterpart, is this association of a script with a national, with a part of an identity. So there is this idea that basically Iran and Nasta'liq are somehow presenting the true Islam. We don't get that reference of the Quran in Nasta'liq if we don't know that 7 years earlier, in 1567, Tahmasp again is sending another Quran to Murad III's predecessor, who was Selim II. Now that Quran was not penned in Nasta'liq, but it was penned in an old form of script, which is called Kufic, which was used at the beginning of Islam. And you understand why 7 years later Tahmasp sent a Quran in Nasta'liq to the Ottoman Sultan. Nasta'liq equals Persian language, equals Iran, equals Shia Islam. They all come together as part of one single identity.
خوشنویسی بخش جدا نشدنی از فرهنگ یک ایرانیه. یعنی همونطور که شعر جزو ذات فرهنگ ایرانی از همه اقوام هست، خوشنویسی هم آمیخته شده با فرهنگ ایرانی، چون تناسباتی در خوشنویسی هست که همراه با فرهنگ، یعنی زبانه، یعنی به خصوص شعر فارسیه و این مجموعه بیننده رو جلب میکنه و جذب میکنه. در واقع از وقتی که فرهنگ شعر فارسی خیلی همه‌گیر شد، به خصوص با اشعار مولوی و سعدی و به خصوص حافظ و بعد از اون، و خوشنویسی نستعلیق این رو در واقع شناسنامه دار کرد، شعر فارسی و خوشنویسی نستعلیق با هم تأثیری رو گذاشتن در فرهنگ یک ایرانی که جدا نشدنی از هر فرد ایرانی.
Persian culture is very old. The West may only have acknowledged and met up with this culture recently, but it's a very ancient classical culture that has art and literature and philosophy and religions and legends of extraordinary depth and variety. And because all of that is held essentially in the jewel box or the treasure chest of its poetry in its form, and because Nesta'liq is the calligraphy in which that is most prized, when an Iranian sees that script, even if it's only on a Happy Nowruz greeting card, when an Iranian sees that script, it embeds, it represents, it's an icon for all of that. And wherever they are, in the diaspora or at home in a street in Tehran, on the shores of the Caspian, in a boulevard in Los Angeles or Washington or Paris or Rome, it contains within it all of that culture and all of that history and, a sense of pride and accomplishment. So I think it's almost like a talisman that holds all of that inside it.